right? Should we get rolling?
We should go. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my little talk. In the agenda, it was named continuously testing your OpenID Connect clients. It sort of evolved into, something that doesn't scream unit testing, but more like testing behaviors. So promptly renamed the presentation to continuously testing your OpenID Connect entity behaviors, because it's not only going to touch the relying parties and clients, but also the OpenID Connect providers. For those, and that's probably all of you who don't know me, I'm fairly new to this space. I'm Filip Skokan. I'm the lead architect. Oh, sorry, Hans. He knows me. I'm the lead architect at a German company called Pro7 Media SE. I lead a team of engineers developing our own single sign-on, but also integrating it into our own relying parties. In my spare time, I'm writing Node.js OpenID Connect libraries, so both OpenID Connect provider and a relying party. You can check them out on GitHub, and I'll be pointing to that GitHub several times throughout the presentation. Why is it important to talk about behavioral testing and testing what assertions a client or a provider should do throughout the interaction with the user and throughout the different interactions the system have throughout the OpenID Connect protocol? I think it comes down to, as Pam brilliantly pointed out, to what did you mention? An expectation that you set. That you set throughout your first talk with an OpenID Connect relying party. And I find myself partly responsible for the state of some of our relying parties, because I go to them and I tell them, listen, you can integrate my OpenID Connect provider, my SSO in under 10 minutes. Just pick a relying party library, you can use any OAuth to one, and you're done. Well, while that's true and you can get to your user information in under 10 minutes, it is not the case that you may end up with a valid and secure implementation. And I'll show you why that is later on. Some other responses that I've received to, why don't you do behavioral testing is, we have our own client and we have a 100% test curve, so we're done, right? Well, no, not really, because if you're not actually having the behavior assertions inside your code, then your test coverage doesn't tell you anything. You're using an open source client library. Well, that's cool. Even better if it's actively maintained, but it doesn't really tell you much unless you've went through, every single line of it and are sure that every single one of those assertions is tested for. You're using a certified OpenID Connect library. Perfect, but as we'll see later on, it's not really 100% of the job done. So what I'm trying to say is it's a good start to pick a good maintained and even better a certified library. But unless there is only one way to integrate that library into your code, you should really look into doing some more testing of your own. So why isn't using a certified library a guarantee of a success? I'll show you an example of my own library where you can call the user info on a client instance with an access token, which is a string. What can you do with just calling the user info with a string access token? You can only do the TLS check, nothing more. You'll get back a JSON, you'll parse the JSON, but it doesn't tell you anything more than that. And that's fine for most, but OpenID Connect gives you the possibility to do more security, to protect yourself from somebody, giving you different responses from user info. So you can get more assertions from my own library when you pass a token set into that user info call, which consists of an ID token that you've received previously and an access token. So not only is it going to parse that ID token, run some expiration checks, see if it's still valid or not, and so on. When it fetches the user info using that access token, which is part of the token set, it will also compare the user info sub-claim that it equals to the ID token one. So then you're actually comparing something you've received previously with something that your OP is giving you back right now. So that's an extra assertion. And it's a good one to have, one actually mentioned in the spec, but commonly missed. And very similar with refresh. Why wouldn't I trust every single library that is out there, even if it's certified? Well, that's because it is very, very hard to get a right test suite for everything that you should be covering. If you have a look at the small cloud in there, it's like all the specs and all the RFCs that you should be covering, and that's a lot of ground to cover. Considering that you need to take care of the OAuth 2 and OAuth 2 defined behaviors. On top of that, OpenID Connect, and while it's simple to integrate, it is not simple to develop. So your OP or your RP could get it wrong. All the underpinnings that are in OpenID Connect, specifically the HOSE family of libraries or specifications, starting with algorithms, signatures, encryption, keys, or just a token. Think about the fact that you can have symmetrical or asymmetrical encryption or signing, and with asymmetrical you can get RSA or elective curve signing. Ideally, your library should be tested for all combinations of these. Then you have the ID token on its own. So, but you have a JWT or JWT library, but an ID token is a profile of a JWT, and it has some extra things in it that are defined in the spec and should be tested for. Required claim presence is one, the targeted audience of the ID token, and in case that you receive multiple audiences as an array, you should be checking that you're the authorized party of a given ID token. The AT and code hashes, very important for implicit and hybrid code flow, hybrid and implicit response types, sorry. Nonce and commonly missed auth time whenever your client is defined with a max age or requires a max age on every single authorization request. JSON web key rotation, this is a biggie on its own. Most commonly, OpenID Connect behaviors are tested by using a playback, a VCR. So you tape some of the responses that you're getting, like the authorization or authentication callbacks, your token and user info responses, and you play them back over and over, and you build your test suite around this. You may be covering 100% of your code because it's maybe just client.process callback and then you pass it the request, but it doesn't mean that you're testing for all the behaviors. So unless you actually have a library of tapes which is yay long, there's more ground to cover. So I would say testing with playback responses is a good start, but it is lazy and incomplete. Because as I mentioned before, there's a lot that you're not going to have a taped response for. Some of the basic ones that I myself failed few of these. I didn't get an ID token back at all. My library just kept on going. But that's a major offense. You shouldn't continue. You should scream, listen, I need an ID token because I did an OpenID Connect request. Invalid hashes, invalid signatures of an ID token. While the authorization code flow, for example, relies on TLS and you're not required to do an ID token signature check, I've seen clients that do an authorization code flow, do not check the signature, and then pass the ID token to another system which just relies upon it. That's the point where your system kind of breaks, because you didn't validate the signature and you cannot be sure that the other system will do so. So what should you do? Should you just tape everything? Should you just go through all the, I think it's around 350 behaviors and tape all of them? No. There's a program ran by the OpenID Foundation. It's a self-certification program which developed a great set of tools that we'll go through that help you to self-certify your library. But as Hans pointed out yesterday, we keep talking about self-certification, but we should label it actually as a testing framework, as a test library, as a test tool for you to make sure that your integration is conformant to a given spec. The certification program lies at openid.net/certification. There are certification programs for both the providers and the relying parties. Currently in a pilot phase, but soon to be finished. I think there's just one or two more issues that we have to figure out. These tools cover all 5 profiles: that's basic, implicit, hybrid, dynamic, and configuration for both OP and RP. There are more profiles coming soon. Profiles such as session management, refresh token, and so on. Self-certification is completely voluntary. You don't have to do it. It is fairly inexpensive to certify if you want to, but it is free to use. You can use those tools even without going through the certification. You can rely on those tools for your own testing. At the moment, there are around 55 entities being certified for 159 profiles. If you go onto that website, you'll see a list of downloadable zip files which contain at the moment, and I probably shouldn't have done that, but that's why the Wi-Fi was so slow. I downloaded all of them, unzipped them, and there's around 6,900, 7,000 unique log files. So that's 7,000 unique behaviors, starting with an authorization request, ending with a successful user info, and even going beyond that, with all the responses, with all the parameters, all the logs included in them for a reference. If you're looking into how to do things right, or if you want to have a look at how Ping does it, you can download those and just go digging. If you find an issue, you can talk to them afterwards. To give you a picture about how many behaviors are tested, my own libraries for Node, it's roughly 340 behaviors being tested for the OP and RP libraries. And again, to give you an idea, just running through these behaviors, I know that test cough shouldn't be taken as a measure of success, but just going through these behaviors covers 75% of my code. And it will be more as soon as we add more profiles. And that's doing testing that covers everything, starting from the request, ending with the user info. Let's go through an example RP test that you may find on one of the programs. It has its ID, which says RP nonce invalid, pretty cryptic. But there's luckily a description that tells you that you should pass a nonce value to the auth request, verify the nonce that is returned to you in the ID token. What you should do, it's also specified in there, is identify that the nonce value that you'll get back is invalid and reject the token. What we would do is set up a client with an issuer pointing to the location of the test tool, an arbitrary client name, and then the name of the test. You would do dynamic client registration and discovery, obviously. First discovery, then registration. You would start the authorization request, again pointing to whatever endpoint you have discovered. And you would consume and assert the rejection. You would consume the response and assert the rejection that is expected. This may look, how this may look in practice. In here, I'm using a standard test framework for JavaScript called Mocha, and a regular HTTP client. A few set of helpers that help me not repeat my code and so on for registration, issuing the authorization request. So you can see I do the registration. I generate a random nonce, because why do it with a fixed one if I can test even further. I do the authorization request, and then I process the callback. The cool thing about this test and this test tool for RPs is that the OP that you're talking to does not have any user interaction. And that's why you can use a plain HTTP client and just listen, or just refer to the location header that you receive in the response and pass it to whatever library that you're using. You parse the response parameters out of it and just use those. I wrap my authorization callback call in a try-catch block and make sure that if it doesn't reject itself, the next line will. And then I assert that the error message I got is the one that I'm expecting. In this case, nonce mismatch. On the other hand, an OP test on top of an ID also has a category. In this case, I'm testing that if I register or I have a static client with user info signed response, I actually get a signed user info. How would you do that with the OP test? You would go onto the website that I'll link to in the resources. You would configure your OP, you would configure your issuer location and the features that you support. You would select the test from a list and you would hit the play button to start an authorization. You would go through your user interactions that are there on the OP side, log in, register, whatever you need to do. And then it would go through the authorization callback phase on the RP side, and you would get your result. It's either going to succeed or it's going to fail, or there's going to be a question mark with possibly it didn't finish. It encountered a different error that meant it cannot determine whether it failed or succeeded. In those cases, there's going to be a button and you will be able to check the logs that we talked about, which actually show you every single log line that the OP tool has generated, the responses that it received, and the requests that it made, so that you can debug and see why is it that a given behavior is failing. So the OIDC Test Tools, it is a test framework for testing the behaviors. It is way more than just a set of pre-recorded responses, and that is because it is going to be using, for example, your issuer ID. It is going to be generating a new ID token every single time you do a test. So it's not fixed in time, and you don't have to do any time cop and going back in time in your tests, so that your pre-recorded authorization callback will be still passing your test. Essentially, the OP test tool is a relying party with predefined expectations, while the RP test tool is a provider with predefined behaviors that you test against. There are public servers or public instances of these tools run by the OpenID Foundation. Both the OP and RP, even though it's in pilot phase, you can already access it. But luckily, by the way, you can use those to get familiar with the tools, to maybe build your test suite around them. But the moment you will be running these over and over and over, you may want to eliminate the network latency, and maybe you want to do them offline. And at that point, you can use a Docker image that Hans prepared. It is part of the repository. It takes one command to get it up and running, and then you have both the OP and RP tools running locally using self-signed certificates. And it is not that big of a deal to give it Let's Encrypt or any other actual valid certification, SSL certificate. I'm not going to be so brave to do a live demo. Nope, not yet. There we go. So this should give you an idea of what the OP tests actually are and how can you utilize the existing tools that are out there to automate OP and RP testing. What I'm doing is launching version 59 of Google Chrome, but actually, yeah, why 59 is, I'll tell you later. And I'm executing a test suite which has, using the Chrome remote interface, it has a set of functionality built in that executes all those tests for me. So it starts my OpenID Connect provider and starts just running the test for me. This can be done completely headless. That's why Chrome 59 was there, because it finally can do headless. It is taking the screenshots of user interactions for you. So by the time it finishes, downloads all the logs from the OP servers. You have a certification package ready, and at that point, what's stopping you from actually submitting your certification? It's pretty straightforward. You don't need to use Google Chrome for this, obviously. You don't need to use the Chrome remote interface. You can use any other framework that is out there, like Selenium or Casper.js, Phantom.js, very cryptic names. And for the OP testing, since there is no user agent required, you can just do it with your standard tools. Yeah. You can ask any question.
So was that all open source software that you were using?
Absolutely. Everything is open sourced. Everything is linked in my GitHub profile, so you can take the test harnesses that I'm using that already have all the going through the test, evaluating whether they finish, downloading the logs, reconfiguring the test tool on the fly. You can take that and use it in your CI, obviously, or your local developer machines. These are, by the way, the logs that I was talking about. You can see everything that the test has received and responded with, and the result, which in this case my test has passed, at least one of them. There we go. There are a few things that are going to help you tremendously when you get into this. You should embrace and learn discovery and dynamic client registration. As a matter of fact, to test your RPs, you must do a dynamic client registration. Only do a single test at a time against an instance. This is a small limitation that hopefully we're going to get rid of at some point, where the tools are from time to time wiping the state of the test when another test is started. So this was something that I ran into from time to time. And if you're seeing some inconsistent behavior, just limit your test to run one at a time. Do not parallel execute them. You should definitely test continuously. You should test every commit that you do. And with the Docker image, this should be very easy to do. You should definitely test every release. You can do that, again, against the Docker image that you have locally, or against the public instance. If your builds are released and they live on the server for more than 24 hours, you should definitely consider executing these tests on a cron basis against the live system. There are, as I mentioned, the example test harnesses, and a brilliant point that Pam made yesterday. If you have a new hire, if you have a new developer in your team, have him go through the certification tests. Have him go through the behaviors that are out there, that are defined and that can be tested. It will help him understand, him or her, the specs. This is, as a matter of fact, how I got into all of this. My first library wasn't conformant at all. It wasn't until I started going through the specs that not only did I actually started understanding OpenID Connect, both OPs and RPs, but I was actually discovering new behaviors that should be out there. And it caught my attention to a level where I integrated all the optional features because I was geeking out and I wanted all those buttons to be green. Yes, please.
So if I write
Actually, it's now time for the questions.
Wait, the mic. Okay, go.
How are we on time?
Thank
Yeah,
you.
you're perfect.
Okay.
So if I write OP and RP by myself, can I still use these test tools?
Yes, absolutely.
So, but in that case, I don't need a Docker image and I don't need a public instance yet, right? Do I still need a Docker image and a public instance?
So this is not your these are not your unit tests. These are actually executing behavior against the deployment of your RP or OP.
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
I see. Okay.
So
Thank you.
you will configure the OP or RP instance with the location of your deployment, and then you will execute the test.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah. Go.
Hi, I work on Azure AD actually. So we went through the OP certification, some profiles of OP certification. I'm curious about the RP certification. When we went through the OP one, we could just use the live service that was in prod. All we needed is to give the test the client ID, client secret, like some valid, app to go through the test. But for RP tests, it was not clear to me in the demo whether you had test hooks into the RP or
Whether I had what?
did you have test hooks into the RP to get the RP tests like you were testing deep validation on different things, which
Mhm.
means you were constructing tokens that probably changed specific parameters and sent to the RP,
Yeah.
which probably means that you had test hooks into the RP to trust
So
tokens
when you're
generated
doing
by
when you're
somebody
doing
else.
RP certification, you're actually getting the responses from an OP. So the OP is the one constructing the tokens and passing them back to you. And it will make it so that it, for example, misses a claim. And then it expects your client to throw an assertion. Obviously, the thing is, the big difference between an OP and an RP test suite is that when you're testing your OP, you have a sense of start and finish on the server side. So it will tell you that you passed. On the other hand, when you're just a relying party that may throw or may not throw, the server has no idea about this. So it can only tell you that it finished running the test, that it gave you the response, but it is then your job as a developer to say, did I actually throw or assert? So when you compile then the certification package, you have to write a statement that says, I have A, executed all the tests that I should, and this is how you can reconstruct my results by running my test harness in a specific way.
So your RP test suite includes a mock OP.
No, my RP test suite runs against the OP, which is the test instance.
There's a reference.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think you're right. There is an OP, a mock OP, as you, sorry. There is indeed an OP responding to the request that your relying party that you want to certify or test is sending requests from. Yeah.
But it is not one you need to implement. It is the one that
I
the...
know.
Good.
So that was a step to the next question. Have you thought about how to test RPs that are existing and live and running?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything for that? Because
Okay.
that's the real concern in the internet right now, right? We all use
Right.
services, so many RPs that are insecure potentially.
So unless you're testing a library, using a standard test
That's
framework,
not interesting.
that's clear. But then what I would suggest is, as you mentioned, to have a test hook and to run, again, either headless or a regular browser with scripted behavior, so that it starts a test in a certain way.
Okay.
I'd like to add to that point. You're right indeed. So using a certified library or software piece to realize your OpenID Connect relying party is great, but maybe not enough, right? Because you can probably configure it in such a way that it's non-conformant anymore, right? And yes, so it does make sense to test your deployment as well. And you can point your deployment towards the certification test suite in the same way that you would test your libraries, yeah. So it's both good for testing software as well as testing deployments, live deployments, yeah.
Which means I have a test hook to trust the token issued by the mock RP in the deployed.
That's true, yes. You have to point it towards the test suite itself rather than your real OPs, yeah.
Yep, right here.
Somehow it doesn't seem like one, because
It's not yet. It's a step later.
Hi there, Phil Backhorn here.
Hi.
So it's great to meet you. I'm Ian McGuinness. I work at Google. I work on the AppAuth library. So I wanted
Same.
to ask what your advice would be to me for AppAuth specifically, given that AppAuth is not a complete RP. It's like a piece of the RP implementation, and in many cases, all I am is the transport for the authorization requests and responses and token requests and so on. But are there pieces of this infrastructure that you've built for RP testing that you think I should be using to validate that the AppAuth implementation is correct? Or is this in a completely different category of testing, do you think?
So AppAuth is a full-blown client, isn't it? It is a full-blown RP.
It's a library.
It's a library, but all of the pieces about ID token verification and everything else are sort of left as an exercise to the reader. Like I deal with the custom tab transport pieces of getting the requests out and the responses back.
Mhm.
But we deliberately don't do things like ID token verification because there's certainly
because you're
reasonable
using
debate about-
authorization code flow.
Well, yeah, there's it's reasonable debate as to whether that verification should be done by the Android application or by its backend, and like I'm not really in control of either of those pieces. I just hand off the requests and responses. So
Interesting.
So I think it would be impossible to certify that AppAuth itself. That can only be done by the end user using your library that should work, right? Which include like like sending the nonce if required. I don't know. So there's plenty of stuff in there, but you wouldn't conform to any profile because you don't do it complete, right? So there's a bunch of tests that are still useful for you. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Ultimately, I hope AppOut will do those ID token validations.
Yeah.
I'm rolling out AppOut to all our relying parties, and I would like to tell them, listen, just do this, and your job is finished.
So there is an open pull request for all the ID token verification pieces.
Mhm.
It is not yet complete. I think the contributor sort of stalled out at one point and is on the roadmap to finish that work that they've got. But I am still concerned that if people rely on the AppAuth library for ID token verification and say, hey, great, the client verified it, and they pass it to the server, and then they ignore the fact that they could be talking to a malicious client from the app site.
I don't even recall this to be mentioned in the README of AppAuth. That it doesn't do the ID token validations should definitely be mentioned out there. Like, listen, if you're passing the ID token to a third-party application or to your backend, do a validation there.
And you'd notice that it's not a certified library, right?
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
All right. Perfect.
All right.
Okay, I think we better finish this up. But thank you so much, Philip.
Thank
That
you
was
all.
amazing.